I'm Amita Baviska. I'm a sociologist and I work at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. We're in Berlin at Hackaway, which is the place where the Anthropocene course is being taught, and this course has been in the making and in the planning for more than a year, and we have a group of about 100 researchers from around the world who are here to be taught by an interdisciplinary team of instructors. And the topics range from very many different perspectives on thinking about the Anthropocene. Yeah, I'm part of a session that's called Filtering the Anthropocene. And the idea behind this session is that at one glance, it first seems as if the Anthropocene is something which is a universal concept, that it concerns the planet, the globe, and universal human welfare and the welfare of non-human species. But the ways in which we understand the problem depends on the lens that we use to filter our understanding of what is at stake. The lens could be because of our discipline, it could be because of our social location, and so there's very many ways in which people think that they have the correct understanding of the Anthropocene, but actually that understanding is filtered through the subjective perspectives that they come from. So I'm part of a group that is teaching a session called Filtering the Anthropocene. The idea is to try and make people aware of the way in which their subjective understandings, which are based on their social location, in fact colors the perspective that they have on the Anthropocene as a global problem. So the fact that somebody comes from Europe, is white, male, and is trained as a climate scientist means that that person will have a very different understanding of what is at stake in the Anthropocene, the kinds of analysis that he will do or the kinds of actions that he will prescribe, than somebody who happens to be a poor Bangladeshi farmer, a woman working in a rural context of extreme poverty. My research continues to be focused on the cultural politics of environment and development, and I first began by looking at the ways in which cultural identities came into action around contestations over natural resources, specifically against a large dam in central India. Then I looked at conflicts over water, which is becoming more and more of a crisis in many parts of India. And then I shifted my work from the countryside to the city, looking at the ways in which, as Indian cities tried to become more world class, so they say, they have seen the creation of new conflicts over both landscapes as well as the livelihoods of very poor people. As middle classes have become more numerous, more entitled, more empowered, they've tried to create a landscape in which they can command the services of the poor, but yet not have to live next to them. So I've looked at the ways in which cities become the places where a certain kind of cultural politics around order and aesthetics and beauty is played out. But now my work is returning much more to the countryside again. I'm interested in the ways in which, in the last generation, almost every Indian has seen a transformation of his or her diet. People are eating very differently from what they ate before. And what's interesting is that what used to be a source of great cultural diversity across the country is now becoming more standardized. People are eating the same cereals, the same kinds of foods. But at the same time, there's also the increase in the incorporation of industrial foods into diets. And by industrial foods, I mean processed foods. So I'm interested in tracking these changes to not only look at how diets are changing and what implications that has from the point of view of nutrition, but also to understand the new kinds of desires that people have about food. Why is it that they would rather consume a packet of Maggi noodles than consume the nutritious food that their mother cooks for them at home? So there's a lot that's going on here in terms of how people feel that by consuming certain goods and not others, they're participating in a larger economy in a form of what I call consumer citizenship. And that's the focus of my current research. I think what we're experiencing in Indian society now is a web of contradictions. There are a lot of contradictory trends at work. So, for instance, poor people are now eating foods which they do not grow, which are being industrially manufactured and so on, which are being produced in different parts of the world. Palm oil is coming from Malaysia, pulses are coming from Turkey and Myanmar. So, all Indians, regardless of whether they're rich or poor, are embedded in these globally circulating networks of commodities, which include food. At the same time, what we find in India is that elites are more and more interested in eating things which are local, which are organic, and so on. So there is this reversal of what used to be trends earlier, where the elite were more cosmopolitan and poor people were eating things which were local. And I think what this inversion has in some ways now created is a bigger debate about what is good to eat and what does it signify in terms of your status and prestige in society. So if today poor people, as well as a lot of middle class people as well, consider it the sign of modernity and civilization to eat food that comes out of a packet, I think over time the fact that elites are now preferring unmilled cereals and going back to whole grains and so on, and organic produce, may well mean that those particular elite habits become popular once again. So far that's not happened, but I think there's some hope for the circulation of elite ideas around what is good to eat that may come back and again inform diets among poor people. What's important to mention here is there are food rights activists who are trying very hard to make sure that the food that is sold to people by the government at a subsidized rate, food that's made available in the school midday meal programs and in the infant and child care centers that are also run by the government, is food that is locally sourced, is food that is freshly cooked rather than being processed food. And I think given the scale of the interventions made by food rights activists, we may well see, if these programs become internalized by the government, that this will bring about a drastic transformation away from processed foods. Mind you, the processed foods industry has been very keen to enter into the subsidized midday meal program that runs in schools, because they see a market emerging through the massive contracts that they will get if the government decides to buy their products. But because of the constant vigilance of right to food activists, so far they haven't managed to be successful in that. And by and large, food in government schools tends to be locally cooked and very often locally procured as well. I think political ecology in India hasn't really changed. If there's any difference, it is that it has become a much more intensely confrontational issue. If since the days of development from the 1950s onwards, the central focus of environmental conflict has been around land and water and forests, those issues are very much alive even today. It's to do with the state takeover of lands which were used as commons by often very poor people in order to sustain themselves. It's to do with the compulsory acquisition of private lands, often very fertile agricultural lands by the government, which then turns them over to particular corporate firms or uses them for urban expansion, or basically converts agricultural land to non-agrarian uses. There's a great deal of protest also about compulsory land acquisition for so-called infrastructure projects, be they mining projects, hydel projects, highways, military installations and so on. And I think the political ecology root of this goes to the fact that many of these appropriations of land or forests or water are from the hands of very poor people into the hands of those who are already somewhat rich and powerful. So it, instead of helping to redistribute resources in a way that creates greater equality, actually makes things much worse. And what we find now, which I think is different from earlier patterns of mobilization, is that in very localized contexts, there are now a number of educated people who have access to the media, who know how to file court cases, who know how to use the different bureaucratic mechanisms available to try and make their campaign more effective. In the past, a lot of rural people just didn't have access to those kinds of skills or those particular forms of human capital. So earlier we would find people from cities going off from educated backgrounds, going to rural India and acting as activists and helping to mobilize local communities. But now we see that the leadership is coming from the communities themselves, and they've grown much more savvy about what their rights are and how they can claim those rights in the public sphere. I think overall these battles have become much more intense in India, and they're going to become even more charged in the future. Because there is a huge drive towards trying to accelerate economic growth as much as possible. And the only way that can happen within India is by intensifying patterns of resource extraction. Because even if you have all kinds of intellectual capital being developed, even those software companies, even those business processing organizations, they still need land. And they still need other kinds of resources, which can only be made available by dispossessing somebody else. So I think political ecology in India is now, than ever before, a really volatile field of action. I think the Indian government is finally putting in place mechanisms to try and deal with some aspects of climate change. And certainly there's some investment in energy efficient technologies and in getting firms to become more compliant with new norms about emissions and so on. What, as a sociologist, I feel the government needs to pay more attention to is the ways of looking at community adaptation to any kind of extraneous change. Because when you are talking about poor communities, often very vulnerable to both social as well as ecological fluctuations, they have over the course of generations devised ways of coping with the kinds of shocks that the system periodically brings to them. I think if one were to understand those techniques through which communities become resilient, be it through their kinship networks, be it through the use of different kinds of skills and ingenuity, then I think that provides the groundwork for being able to then think about adaptation to climate change. Even as at the same time we know that the scale of new unprecedented events will demand much more from people in terms of adaptation, will be a bigger challenge than before. But I think we need to look systematically at the old and then from that build a bridge to new challenges in order to be able to develop effective strategies that are both collective and that build on what is already in place. I think the Anthropocene idea is a provocative one because it forces us to shift attention to a very different scale of analysis, a temporal scale that we generally don't usually think of, especially those of us who work on contemporary politics and contemporary society and culture. But it also forces us to think about a different spatial scale. At the same time, I should say that I'm a little bit of a skeptic when it comes to the idea of the Anthropocene, because I see it as catching fire at this time. And whenever I see an idea become very popular, I immediately become a little suspicious of who is promoting it and what kind of political work it does. And the fact that the idea of the Anthropocene directs our attention to a certain scale, the planetary scale, to a certain temporal scale, which is that of thousands of years, in a way then makes me pay attention to the kinds of processes and geographies that it is occluding, that it is pushing to the sides and marginalizing. I'm concerned by the way in which the Anthropocene is also part of a larger attention to climate change that in countries like India seems to have completely taken over any discussion of environmental issues. If you're an Indian social scientist or natural scientist and you want to work on an environmental question in terms of your research, the likelihood that you will get funded if that question is related to climate change is very high. But if it's not related to climate change, it's that much harder to get support for your work. So there's a way in which climate change, while no doubt extremely important, has completely overridden all other very important environmental questions that people deal with on a day-to-day basis in their lives today, which could be to do with not just the air, but also with soil and water and environmental risk and hazard. None of these questions are going away just because climate change is also on the agenda. And therefore, to the extent that the Anthropocene concept, makes us shift attention away from these older and more enduring questions, I tend to be a bit cautious about accepting it as the main question to be studied, even as I think philosophically, ethically, it does direct our attention in ways which are very productive and which in a way shed light on other environmental questions as well. Our relationships with other species, our relationship with other aspects of the, of the earth, which are, I think, salient in other kinds of environmental conflicts as well. Based in India, I think we tend to be surrounded by such pressing and overwhelming questions that the Anthropocene seems a little bit of an indulgence. We are talking about it, but at the same time it seems as if the concept has come from the people who created the problem in the first place. Are we really talking about an Anthropocene age, or are we talking about an Anglocene age? And if you're talking about an Anglocene age, then surely that transforms both the concept as well as the terms on which we debate it. I don't think there's a common future. I think the very point that needs to be emphasized again and again with respect to the Anthropocene is that even though it talks about us and we, there is no common us or we. We're all not only different, but we're all connected in hierarchies of power and knowledge. And as long as that's the case, there will always be winners and losers. There will always be people who will do better and some who will do worse. And therefore, we cannot talk about a common future unless we can talk about ways of bridging these great inequalities that divide us through some active politics of coming together in ways which create greater equality, which create common understandings. But that is a long and hard battle that must be fought if we are even to talk about a common future.